an old church in Amsterdam, a statue of Jesus. That you be silent learns to walk, breathe, and judge, sucking away people's guilt until dreams turn into wounds, prayers into snares, and faith into a weapon that turns against its owner. It drags its cross at night, whispering the deepest sins, breaking people's bodies on their knees, screaming in the mind as it burns. Then disappears, only to be reborn in another church, with wet footprints beneath a tiff. Faith can create monsters and disbelief cannot kill them. Then when the statue opens its eyes again, will it be judged next by our sins, or our courage to keep believing? The church on Kaisersgracht leaned inward, as if listening to the canal whisper secrets meant only for stone. Its bricks were blackened by centuries of damp winters and candle smoke, and the bell tower no longer rang, not because it could not, but because no one dared pull the rope. In the evenings, mist slid off the water and gathered at the doors, clinging to the carvings of saints whose faces had eroded into blank, patient masks. Locals crossed the street when they passed it. Those who lived nearby shut their windows early. It was 1980, and Amsterdam was changing. Neon lights bloomed in shop windows. Music throbbed from cafes, and tourists wandered the canals with careless laughter. But the church remained untouched by that noise, a pocket of older air sealed off from the present. It belonged to no parish anymore. Officially, it was awaiting reassignment. Unofficially, it was waiting for something else. Inside, the silence was not empty. It pressed down, heavy as damp wool. The nave smelled of mildew and old incense, a sweetness gone sour. Wooden pews sat crooked, their kneelers chewed by time. High above the altar, a single stained glass window filtered the gray daylight into bruised colors: purple, rust, a sickly yellow that never quite warmed the stone floor. At the center hung the crucifix. The statue of Jesus Christ was life-sized, carved centuries earlier by an unknown hand whose devotion had bordered on obsession. The ribs showed too clearly beneath the skin. The wounds were not symbolic, but anatomical, precise. Most unsettling were the eyes. Half open, glassy, yet focused, as if cocked from certain angles. They seemed to follow movement in the church, not actively, but with the slow inevitability of something aware. No one remembered when the eyes had first been carved that way. Some claimed they had once been closed. The caretakers arrived on a Monday morning, dragging suitcases over the uneven stones. Peter Van Dyke held the church keys like a burden rather than a tool. He had accepted the position because work was scarce and the diocese paid in cash. No questions asked. His wife Mariki followed him inside, her scarf tied around her hair. Despite the lack of wind, she paused at the threshold, her hand lingering on the doorframe, as if the building might pulse beneath her palm. "It smells like a cellar," she said. "It's only old," Peter replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Their duties were simple: clean what could be cleaned, keep vandals out, light candles on Sundays for the occasional visitor who still believed the place holy. They were not told why the previous caretaker had left so abruptly, nor why his room behind the sacristy remained untouched, his bed still made, his coat still hanging, his rosary coiled neatly on the nightstand. Mariki noticed the crucifix immediately. Her breath caught not in reverence, but in something closer to recognition, like meeting a stranger who already knew her name. The statue's face was tilted slightly downward, shadow pooling in the hollows of its cheeks. "Why are the eyes open?" she asked quietly. Peter glanced up. "They always are, I think." That night, rain tapped softly against the stained glass, and the church sank into its deeper rhythms. Wood creaked, stone cooled. The canal outside exhaled mist through the cracks in the walls. Peter slept heavily, exhausted by the day's labor. Mariki did not. She lay awake, listening. There were sounds she could explain: the distant hum of traffic, the groan of pipes, but others resisted reason. A faint rasp, like breath dragged through a dry throat. The subtle complaint of rope fibers shifting, though the bell was still. At so many points she became aware of a pressure behind her eyes, the unmistakable sensation of being observed without movement or sound. She sat up. The church was dark, but not blind. Moonlight spilled in pale ribbons across the floor, stopping just short of the altar. Mariki told herself she would only look, only reassure herself that nothing had changed. The crucifix loomed above her. The statue was exactly where it had been, and yet She was certain, absolutely certain, that the eyes were open wider than before. She did not scream. She did not pray. She simply stood there, heart pounding, while the church held its breath around her. Somewhere in the rafters, something shifted, as if adjusting its weight. By morning, the certainty would already feel like madness. But the church did not forget, and it had all night to remember. Peter woke at exactly 3:17 a.m. There was no dream clinging to him, no lingering image or sensation to explain why his eyes snapped open. The darkness of the caretaker's room pressed close, thick and airless. For a moment, he lay still, listening to his own breathing, counting the seconds between each inhale as he had learned to do during his years of sleeplessness. Then he heard it. A sound too soft to be accidental, too deliberate to be dismissed. Bare feet against stone, not a shuffle, not a stumble-measured steps. Slow and unhurried, crossing the nave. The noise carried easily through the church as a hollow body, each footfall echoing faintly before dissolving into silence. Peter's heart began to hammer. He told himself it was Mariki walking in her sleep, disturbed again by the building's strange acoustics. But the steps were wrong. They were naked against the floor, skin meeting cold stone without hesitation or pain. "Mariki," he whispered. No answer. The footsteps stopped. Peter sat up, the bedsheets clinging damply to his skin. He strained to hear anything else breathing. Fabric, brushing fabric, even the faint creak of the floorboards near the sacristy door. There was nothing. The church had resumed its unnatural stillness, as if it had been holding its breath and was now waiting. Against his better judgment, Peter stood. The room was darker than usual. Moonlight barely reached this far back, and the small lamp on the nightstand flickered when he switched it on, casting weak, trembling shadows. He dressed quickly, hands clumsy, and eased the door open. The nave stretched before him, vast and dim. Rows of pews lay half-submerged in shadow. The altar stood at the far end, elevated and distant, framed by columns that vanished into darkness above. And there, suspended in the gloom, was the crucifix. It was exactly where it had been. Jesus hung with his head bowed, arms extended, body frozen in its eternal suffering. The eyes appeared half open, no wider than Peter remembered. No movement, no sound. No. Relief came too quickly, sharp and embarrassing. "You're tired," he muttered. "That's all." He took a few steps forward, the echo of his own shoes suddenly deafening. As he approached the altar, something pale near the base of the cross caught his eye. He slowed, then stopped entirely. The stone floor beneath the crucifix was dusted with a fine layer of gray, powder-crumbled mortars, and centuries of neglect. Peter had swept the nave earlier that evening. He remembered it clearly. He had been thorough. Pressed into the dust were footprints. Bare footprints. They were unmistakable. The curve of a heel, the spread of toes, the slight drag where weight had shifted forward. They stood directly beneath the cross, close enough that whoever or whatever had made them would have been standing almost against the base. Peter crouched slowly, his knees protesting. The dust was undisturbed elsewhere. The prints were fresh, sharp-edged, as if made moments ago. They did not lead away. They simply stopped, as though the owner had vanished where they stood. A cold sweat broke across his back. This is not real, he thought. This is exhaustion. This is suggestion. Mariki said the eyes looked different, and now behind him, wood creaked. Peter spun around. Nothing. The pews remained empty. Shadows lay where they always had, yet the sense of being watched returned, stronger now, coiling in his chest. He stood, backing away from the altar, never taking his eyes off the crucifix. "You didn't move," he said aloud, his voice brittle. "You can't move." The words sounded foolish in the vastness of the church. He retreated to the caretaker's room and locked the door, sliding down against it, breath coming too fast. He stayed there until dawn bled slowly into the stained glass, coloring the floor with bruised light. When Mariki woke, she found him sitting at the small table, hands wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee. "You look ill?" she said. "There were footsteps," he replied. "In the night." Her face tightened. "I heard nothing." Esitate then told her about the footprints, about the dust, about the way they ended beneath the cross. She listened without interrupting, her gaze drifting past him toward the nave, as if she expected the church to be listening. When he finished, she said softly, "Did you check your shoes?" "Yes," Peter snapped, then immediately soft. "I did. I was wearing them." Remember. Mariki said nothing more. Later that morning, Peter returned to the altar with a broom. The footprints were gone. The dust lay smooth and undisturbed, as though it had never been touched. He stood there for a long time, staring up at the statue. The eyes seemed the same, yet he could not shake the certainty that something had been there in the night. Something that did not leave the way it arrived. At 3:17 a.m., the church had woken, and it was learning how to walk. By the end of the week, the church was no longer alone with its secret. It began subtly, the way Rod always does. Quiet, polite, easy to ignore. A woman from 2 houses down stopped Mariki one morning by the canal, her groceries clutched too tightly to her chest. "You live in the old church now," she said, not as a question. Mariki nodded. "Das the Christ Stewart?" the woman asked, her voice light, almost hucking. Mariki felt a small, sharp chill. "What's what?" The woman laughed too quickly. "Nothing. Forget I asked." But she did not meet Mariki's eyes before hurrying away. Others noticed things as well. A man who wandered in to light a candle swore the statue's head had been tilted slightly more to the left than the week before. A tourist attempted to photograph the crucifix and left abruptly, pale and sweating, deleting the images from his camera without explanation. Word spread not loudly, not officially, but in murmurs traded over coffee and confessions made halfway through sentences. The eyes were wrong. Peter dismissed it all at first. He had to. The alternative required admitting that his certainty at 3:17 a.m. had been justified. Still, he began to watch the statue more closely, measuring it against memory, against reason. Each morning, the crucifix appeared unchanged. Each evening, doubt crept back in. One afternoon, Mariki brought a borrowed camera into the nave. "If people are talking," she said, "we should see for ourselves." Peter frowned. "Photographs won't prove anything. They might prove we're imagining it." She took the first picture from the center aisle, then another from the left pews, then one standing directly beneath the cross, angling the lens upward. The camera clicked softly, each sound swallowed by the church's silence. They developed the photographs that evening at a small shop nearby. Peter waited while Mariki flipped through the glossy prints under fluorescent light. Her hands began to tremble. In the first image, the statue's eyes were half open, unfocused, as Peter remembered them. In the second, the gaze appeared sharper, the pupils slightly more centered. In the third, "They're looking down," Mariki whispered. Peter leaned closer. The difference was subtle, but undeniable. The eyes in each photograph were not the same. They shifted by degrees, by fractions of intent, like a man adjusting his attention without moving his head. The shop clerk cleared his throat. "Bad development," he said quickly. "Light, exposure, maybe." Peter nodded, paid, and took the photographs home. He placed them face down in a drawer and did not look at them again. Sister Agnes arrived on Sunday. She was small, gray-haired, and stooped, sent by the diocese to assess whether the church might be reopened for limited services. Her smile was kind but strained, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She carried her suitcase herself and refused help. "I don't sleep well," she admitted when Mariki offered her tea. "Haven't for some time." That evening, Sister Agnes stood alone before the crucifix for nearly an hour. She did not pray aloud. She simply watched. Later, in the guest room, she lay awake as the church breathed around her. She counted her own inhalations, each one careful, deliberate. The darkness felt attentive. She became certain slowly, inexorably, that she was not alone, not in the room, not in her body. The sensation was intimate and invasive, as if something unseen were leaning close, listening to the rise and fall of her chest. She did not open her eyes. She was afraid that if she did, she would confirm what she already knew, that the statue was watching her breathe. By the third night, she stopped sleeping altogether. Her prayers grew disjointed, repetitive. She began leaving her door open, then closing it again, unable to decide which felt safer. At 3:17 a.m., she sat bolt upright, certain she heard movement soft, patient steps passing her room and heading toward the altar. In the morning, she confronted Peter. "It never closes its eyes," she said, "not even when no one is looking." Peter tried to reassure her. He failed. That afternoon, Sister Agnes packed her belongings with shaking hands. She left without blessing the church, without saying goodbye to the crucifix. At the door, she paused and turned back once, tears streaking her lined face. "It sees us," she said, "and it is learning us." When she was gone, the church felt larger, more awake. That night, Mariki dreamed of eyes opening wider and wider, never blinking, never resting, and beneath the cross, the dust waited. The boy's name was Lucas Vermeer, and he was 12 years old when the church broke its own stillness. He had been part of the choir once, years before the services dwindled to nothing. His voice had not yet changed, then Rai, obedient. Even after the church closed, Lucas returned on his own, slipping inside after school to sit in the back pews and hum hymns. He barely understood. His mother thought the building calmed him. In a way, she was right. On the night it happened, Lucas refused to go home. A storm rolled in late, rain lashing the canals and driving the city into an early hush. Peter had already locked the doors when he found the boy tucked behind the third pew, knees drawn to his chest. "You can't stay here," Peter said, more gently than he felt. "It's not safe." Lucas looked toward the altar. "He doesn't like to be alone." Peter froze.
"Who?"
But the boy only shrugged, against his better judgment and perhaps because he was tired of arguing with the darkness. Pieter Lucas to sleep in the caretaker's room. A blanket, a pillow, a stern warning not to wander. Lucas nodded, wide-eyed and solemn. He waited until the church sank into its deepest quiet. At 3:17 a.m., Lucas opened his eyes. He did not know why. He only knew he had to be awake. The air felt different, thicker, expectant, like the moment before a choir began to sing. He slipped from the narrow bed and padded barefoot into the nave, the stone cold but familiar beneath his feet. Moonlight cut the darkness into pale shapes. The altar glowed faintly. The crucifix hung above it, just as it always had. Lucas stood very still. At first, nothing happened. Then came the sound. A sharp, brittle crack echoed through the church, too loud to be wood, too wet to be stone. Lucas clamped a hand over his mouth, eyes wide. Another sound followed along, groaning pull, like joints forced awake after centuries of sleep. The statue's right hand moved. It did not tear free. It did not fall. It shifted slowly, with unbearable effort. Fingers that had been clenched for hundreds of years began to uncurl. The nail did not slide out. Instead, the hand twisted around it, skin stretching, the sound like old timber splitting under strain. Lucas wanted to run. His legs would not obey. The left hand followed. Crack. Groan. The arms lowered by inches, then more, shoulders rolling forward with a terrible intimacy, as though the figure were easing itself out of pain, rather than escaping it. The head lifted slightly. Just enough. The eyes opened fully. They were not empty. They were focused. Lucas felt the gaze settle on him, precise and complete, as if every thought he had ever had were being read aloud inside his skull. His breath came in shallow, stuttering gasps. The feet did not move. Not yet. The church seemed to bend inward, stone and wood straining to listen. Dust fell in soft streams from the rafters. Somewhere, a rope creaked, though no bell rang. Lucas screamed. The sound ripped through the nave, raw and animal. It broke the spell. The statue stopped. The hands did not return to their places. They remained twisted, lowered, fingers slack and aching. The eyes did not close. Lights flared behind Lucas as Peter burst into the nave, shouting his name. Mariki followed, breathless, her hand gripping his arm. They saw the boy on the floor, shaking violently, his scream collapsing into hoarse, broken sounds. They did not see the movement. By the time Peter looked up, the statue was still again, arms outstretched. head bowed, the illusion of eternal suffering restored. Only the faintest difference remained. The hands sat lower on the nails, as if they had slipped and been forced back. Lucas never spoke another word. He was taken to a doctor. Then, another. He responded to nothing, not questions, not comfort. He ate when food was placed in front of him. He slept when exhaustion overtook him. But he drew, over and over again. Lucas filled page after page with crosses. They were wrong-bent, elongated, arms twisted at impossible angles. Some had hands halfway removed. Some had eyes carved too large, staring outward from the page. Always watching. When Peter visited him weeks later, Lucas looked up briefly. For just a moment his mouth opened, as if to speak. Instead, he picked up his pencil and drew another cross. Outside the church waited. It had learned how to move its hands. Next, it would learn how to step down. The confession booths were the first to wake. They stood along the north wall, 3 narrow wooden structures darkened by age and absorbed secrets. Their doors had not opened in years. Dust sealed their hinges. The red lamps above them no longer burned. Peter considered removing them entirely, but something habit, superstition, fear stopped him. On the 5th night after Lucas was taken away, Mariki heard the whispering. It slid into her dreams at first, weaving itself into the fragile fabric of sleep. A voice calling her name softly, intimately, the way her mother used to when she was a child and afraid of the dark. Mariki, it breathed. She woke with a gasp. The room was empty. Peter slept beside her, unmoving. The church lay silent beyond the thin walls too. Silent. Then the whisper came again, clearer now, carrying the faint echo of wood and enclosed space. Come confess. Mariki sat up, heart pounding. The voice was wrong. It sounded like her mother, but hollowed out, stretched thin, as if memory itself were being poorly imitated. She did not answer. The next night, Peter heard it too. He was awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the slow decay of seconds. From somewhere in the nave came a murmur, low and rhythmic, like prayers spoken backward. Peter, the voice said. It was his father's voice. Dead 10 years. Ashes scattered in the North Sea. You never told them, it whispered. You never told anyone. Peter squeezed his eyes shut. This isn't real, he said aloud. The voice softened. Then why does it hurt? The whispers came only at night, always after 3:17 a.m. They leaked from the confession booths, slipping through their thin walls and curling into the open space of the church. Sometimes they overlapped men, women, children each, calling a different name. Each using a voice that belonged to the listener's past. No priest ever appeared, yet the booths demanded confession all the same. A man from the neighborhood was the first to enter. He arrived pale and trembling just before dawn, knocking on the church doors until Peter let him in. His eyes darted constantly toward the north wall. It knows, he said. It knows what I did. Peter tried to calm him, offered coffee, offered reason. The man shook his head violently and broke free, staggering toward the booths. Mariki screamed for him to stop. The booth door closed with a dull, final sound. For several minutes, there was only silence. Then came sobbing. Words followed fast, desperate, spilling out in broken fragments. Guilt confessed without structure or mercy. Betrayals, violence, thoughts never spoken aloud. The voice inside the booth murmured back, gentle, encouraging. When the man emerged, his face was empty. Not calm, not relieved. Simply hollowed out, like something essential had been removed. He never returned to the church. Others followed, always at night, always drawn by voices only they could hear. Peter tried locking the booths, nailing the doors shut, but each morning the locks were undone, the nails loosened and resting neatly on the floor. And each morning, the statue stood closer. At first, it was Satala. Matter of perspective, Peter told himself. The crucifix still loomed above the altar, but the space between it and the confession booths seemed to shrink. The distance felt wrong. Then Mariki noticed the floor. Dark stains marked the stone beneath the statue's feet. Moisture that did not evaporate. It smeared under touch, thick and sticky, smelling faintly of iron and canal water. Feet, she thought. Not blood. Not yet. The statue's toes appeared darker than before, shadowed as though soaked. One morning, Peter measured the distance. The crucifix was no longer fixed to the wall. It stood free, just inches closer to the booths than the day before. No drag marks marred the floor. No footprints disturbed the dust. It had not walked. It had arrived. That night, the whispering grew louder. Mariki heard her own voice coming from the booth confessing things she had never said aloud, things she had barely admitted to herself. Peter heard Lucas crying, heard his father praying. They covered their ears. They prayed. They argued. They did not sleep. At 3:17 a.m., the statue shifted its weight. The sound was unmistakable. Stone adjusting against stone. A soft, wet scrape followed. One foot stood closer to the booths. The church did not ask permission anymore. It had learned the language of guilt, and it was listening. The smell came before the sound. It crept through the church like a living thing, seeping under doors, settling into cloth and hair and lungs. Iron sharp and metallico vent together with burned incense so thick it tasted bitter on the tongue. It was the scent of ritual gone wrong, of prayer overheated into something violent. Mariki woke, choking. Her eyes burned. Her throat tightened as if hands had closed around it in the night. For a moment she thought the church was on fire. She shook Peter awake, and he sat up coughing, his face already pale. "Do you smell that?" she whispered. He nodded grimly. "Yes." They dressed quickly and stepped into the nave. The odor was stronger there, almost solid. It clung to the pillars, pooled beneath the altar, and thickened toward the front of the church. Someone was kneeling. She was small, her back hunched in devotion, habit draped neatly over her shoulders. At first glance, she looked like she was praying. Bowed hands raised slightly, fingers interlaced. Then Mariki screamed. The nun's forehead was crushed flat against the stone floor, bone fractured outward like broken porcelain. Blood had spread beneath her face in a dark halo, already drying at the edges. Her neck was bent at an angle no living body could maintain. Her hands were worse. The fingers were folded back against themselves, bent at the joints in impossible directions. Palms turned outward as though forced into a parody of prayer. Tendons stretched pale beneath torn skin. The position was deliberate, careful, reverent. Peter staggered backward, retching. The smell intensified, as if the church itself were breathing it out in satisfaction. "Don't touch her," Mariki sobbed. "Please don't." Peter's gaze lifted slowly, irresistibly, to the statue. It stood directly before the nun. No cross, no nails. Christ stood upright on the stone floor, arms lowered at his sides, head inclined as if listening. The wounds in his hands were open, dark and wet. His feet were stained the same deep color as the pool beneath the nun's skull. The eyes were fully open. They were not looking at the body. They were looking at Peter. A pressure filled the room, an awareness, so complete it felt invasive, like fingers probing the inside of his thoughts. Peter dropped to his knees, gasping, clutching his chest. "I didn't mean," he began, though he did not know what he was confessing. The statue did not move, but the incense flared. The church bells rang once. Not from the tower, from inside the walls. Mariki dragged Peter backward, screaming his name, her shoes slipping in blood she did not want to acknowledge. They fled into the caretaker's room and slammed the door shut, barricading it with furniture. They did not call the police. Somehow, instinctively, they knew that if they did, the church would not allow them to leave. Morning came slowly, reluctantly. When light finally filtered through the stained glass, the smell had faded to a dull, lingering trace. The nave was silent. The body was gone. There was no blood, no sign of struggle. The stone floor lay clean and cold, as if it had never known warmth or flesh. Only the statue remained. Back on the cross, perfectly positioned. The wounds were sealed. The feet were clean. The eyes were half open again, mercifully unfocused. Mariki sank to the floor and wept until her body shook apart. Later that day, a report circulated quietly through the diocese. A nun sister, Helena, is missing. Last seen traveling alone. No destination confirmed. Peter scrubbed the church obsessively, though there was nothing to clean. His hands bled from the effort. The smell of incense lingered no matter what he used, embedded deep in the stone. That night, neither of them slept. At 3:17 a.m., the smell returned faint, but unmistakable. And somewhere near the altar, fingers cracked softly, bending back into prayer once more. The first witness was a man who should not have been there. He was a vagrant, sleeping beneath the arches along Kaiser, drawn inside the church by the promise of shelter and the strange warmth that now pulsed from its stones at night. He would later insist he had not been dreaming. He would later insist he wished he had been. At 3:17 a.m., the church screamed, not with a voice but with its body. Wood shrieked, as if flayed alive. A sound rose through the nave that set teeth on edge and curdled the stomach. The tortured cry of timber dragged against stone layered with something wetter, heavier, the dull crack and grind of bone forced to move where it should not. The man crawled beneath a pew, hands clamped over his ears. He saw the statue move. Not standing, not walking. Dragging. The crucifix lay tilted behind it, the massive wooden cross gouging deep scars into the stone floor as it was hauled forward inch by inch. The statue's arms were wrapped around the beam, fingers dug deep into the rotting wood. Each movement came with a convulsion, joints locking and unlocking with violent pops that echoed through the church like gunshots. The head was raised. The eyes were open. They were weeping, not tears, something darker, thicker, seeping from the corners and streaking down the statue as a face in slow reverent lines. The mouth was parted as if mid-breath or mid-cry. The man fled before the statue reached the first pew. By morning, others had seen the evidence. The floor was ruined. Deep grooves carved across the nave, spiraling toward the confession booths, like a deliberate path. Splinters of ancient wood littered the ground. The altar had shifted several inches to the right, and the walls. Mariki found the writing first. She was scrubbing near the north wall when her hand brushed against something sharp. She recoiled, gasping. Carved into the stone were words. Not painted, not etched with tools. Scratched. Fingernail marks bit deep into the surface, uneven and frantic, yet legible. Familiar verses once she had learned as a child were rewritten, their shapes twisted, their meanings corrupted. For I see all things had become, for I see you always confess and be forgiven, became confess and remain. Lower down, where someone showed a roar. Kneeling might have read. A final line was carved again and again, overlapping itself in violent repetition. Do not lie to me. Peter staggered back, his mind unraveling. This isn't vandalism, he whispered. No one could do this. At night, more witnesses came. They stood across the canal, staring through the stained glass as shadows shifted impossibly inside. Some swore they saw the cross move on its own, inching forward like a massive insect. Others heard the sounds with screaming, stone grinding, a rhythm like labored breathing accompanying each drag. No one entered the church anymore, but the church reached out all the same. The scratches spread. Each morning revealed new verses, higher up the walls, as if the thing carving them had grown taller or more confident. The handwriting grew steadier, the threats more specific. I know your sins. I remember your names. In the caretaker's room, Peter began to hear the sound of nails scraping stone, even during the day. He pressed his hands to his ears until they bled, but the noise crept in through his bones. Mariki started covering the walls with cloth, then boards. By morning, the coverings were shredded, torn apart from the inside. At 3:17 a.m., the statue dragged the cross again. This time, it reached the confession booths. The doors burst inward under the impact, wood splintering like brittle ribs. The cross wedged itself between them, blocking escape, anchoring the nave like a judgment made physical. When morning came, the statue stood upright beside it. One hand rested on the crossbeam. The other pointed toward the caretaker's room, and beneath the pointing finger, carved fresh into the wall, was a final verse deep, clean, certain. Come closer. The living cross had found its place, and it was no longer waiting to be witnessed. The dreams began the same night for everyone. There was no trumpet, no warning, only the sensation of being watched, even with eyes closed, followed by the slow certainty that sleep was no longer a refuge. Those who dreamed of the church dreamed of it empty, vast, stripped of sound. The air was thick with incense and iron. The floor was cold beneath bare feet, and at the center stood the statue, not on the cross, not dragging it. Waiting. Peter dreamed first. He stood alone before the altar, his hands bound behind his back. The statue's eyes were fully open now, luminous and exact, reflecting not light but memory. Its mouth did not move when it spoke. You chose silence, it said. Peter felt the words inside his skull rather than his ears. They carried no anger, no mercy, only accuracy. You knew what he was doing, the voice continued. He said nothing. Peter tried to speak, to deny it, but his throat closed. Images flooded. Him years old, buried deep, a boy at the factory. Bruises he had noticed and ignored, a complaint he had torn up because he needed the job. The statue stepped closer. Its feet left wet marks on the stone. You mistook survival for innocence, it said. Peter woke screaming. Blood soaked to the sheets. His palms burned as if pierced by hot metal. In the center of each hand, raw wounds wept slowly, circular and precise, not deep enough to kill, deep enough to remember. Marique's dreams were quieter. She dreamed of kneeling before the statue as a child, reciting prayers she did not understand. The church was smaller then, warmer. Her mother's hand rested on her shoulder, heavy, insistent. Tell him, the statue whispered, its face inches from hers. Tell him what you wanted. Marique shook her head in the dream. She felt shame rise like bile, thoughts she had never given shape, jealousies, resentments, the relief she had felt when her mother finally died. The statue's fingers brushed her forehead. You loved her, it said, and you wished her gone. Marique woke sobbing. Her feet were slick with blood. At the arch of each sole bloomed deep, hatching wounds, as if nails had been pressed but not driven into her flesh. Across Amsterdam, others woke the same way. A man who had cheated his brother woke with a wound at his side, gasping for breath. A woman who had abandoned her child woke with blood staining her ribs, convinced she could feel hands pushing her away. A priest who had broken his vows woke with his mouth torn open, blood crusted at the corners, unable to speak. None of them dreamed of forgiveness. The statue never offered absolution. It only spoke truths. By the third night, people stopped sleeping. Those who tried found themselves standing again before the altar, regardless of where they lay down. The statue appeared closer each time, its features more defined, the wounds on its body mirroring those it inflicted. It learned quickly. It tailored its words. No sin was too small. No thought too fleeting. Regret itself became evidence. You enjoyed it. The statue told a woman who had once felt relief at another's failure. You could have stopped. It told a man who had looked away. You prayed. It told a nun who had done nothing else, and called that enough. Some woke bleeding. Others did not wake at all. The city whispered about a sickness, about hysteria, about mass delusion. Doctors blamed stress. Priests blamed doubt. No one blamed the church out loud, but no one went near it anymore. Inside, Peter tried to stay awake. He paced the nave at night, clutching a crucifix of his own, eyes burning, hands bandaged. Marique begged him to leave with her, to abandon the church before it finished whatever it had begun. It already knows, he said hollowly. Running won't change that. At 3:17 a.m., he faltered. Sleep claimed him for a moment. The statue stood before him immediately. Closer than ever, it reached out not to strike, not to wound, but to touch his chest. You ask if you are punished, it said, its finger pressed gently against his heart, or forgiven. The pressure increased. You misunderstand, it whispered. Guilt is not a debt. Crack. Peter woke choking, blood blooming through his shirt in a perfect, radiant mark. The statue did not follow him into the waking world. It did not need to. It had learned the most effective weapon of all, and it was mercy-shaped. The church inhaled. Not as a metaphor, not as imagination. It drew air into itself with a slow, cavernous sound, like lungs filling deep beneath stone and mortar. The candles along the nave guttered inward, their flames bending toward the walls, as if pulled by an unseen current. Mariki felt it first through her hands. She had braced herself against a pillar, steadying her trembling body, when the stone beneath her palms grew warm then damp. Moisture beaded along the surface, thick and salty, seeping from the pores of the wall like sweat. She recoiled, wiping her hands against her dress, heart racing. "Peter," she whispered. The church is the floor shuddered. Not violently. Not enough to knock them down. Just a subtle contraction, a slow tightening and release that traveled beneath their feet. A pulse. Once. Then again, a heartbeat. Peter closed his eyes. He could feel it through his bandaged palms, through the soles of his feet, through the bones of his legs. The rhythm was wrong, not human, not steady. It hesitated, surged, then settled into something almost patient. "Don't move," he said, though he did not know why. Night had fallen without them noticing, or perhaps it had never fully lifted. Time had begun to slip. They had entered the nave just after sunset, or so they believed, yet the stained glass now held no color, only black voids where light should have been. The air was thick and stale, heavy with the now familiar scent of incense and iron. The doors were gone. Where the heavy wooden entrance should have been stood, only stone smooth, unbroken, ancient. Mariki ran to it, pounding until her hands ached. "There were doors here," she cried. The church exhaled. The sound rolled through the nave like a sigh of satisfaction. The walls flexed inward by inches, then relaxed, stone grinding softly against stone. From the far end of the nave, something moved. No footsteps, no dragging. Just absence shifting into presence. The statue stood between the pews. It had not crossed the space. It had arrived. Its body was more defined now, muscles carved sharper, veins dark beneath stone skin. The wounds no longer looked ancient. They looked recent, wet. Its head tilted, listening not to sound, but to fear. Mariki screamed. The sound vanished before it reached the rafters, swallowed instantly by the breathing walls. Panic surged through her as she realized the church was not echoing anymore. It was absorbing. They ran, or thought they did. The distance between pews stretched impossibly, each row taking minutes to cross or seconds. Mariki could no longer tell. Her legs burned, then numbed, then burned again. Her breath came in frantic bursts, each one echoing inside her skull but nowhere else. The pulse beneath the floor quickened. The statue followed, silently, always at the edge of vision, never rushing, never straining. Each time Mariki glanced back, it was closer by an amount she could not measure. Peter stumbled, their failed hard hands striking the floor. The stone yielded slightly beneath the impact, then pushed back, elastic and wrong. He screamed as something tightened around his wrists, not hands, not rope, but the floor itself, bulging upward to hold him in place. Peter Mariki sobbed, clawing at the stone. The church inhaled deeply. Time fractured. Mariki felt herself kneeling beside him for hours, begging, praying, screaming. Then suddenly it was a single heartbeat later, and the statue was standing over them. Its shadow pulsed with the rhythm of the floor. "You are inside me," it said, not aloud, but everywhere. Peter looked up, tears cutting clean paths through the grime on his face. "What do you want?" The statue considered this. "I am becoming," it replied. It reached down, not touching flesh, but space. The air thickened, resisting Marique's movements, slowing her thoughts. Her memories began to blur at the edges. How long had they been here? Minutes. Days. The walls wept openly now, dark streaks running down to pool at the base of the pillars. The ceiling lowered by inches, then more. The church was closing around them. Suddenly, the pulse stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. The statue turned its head toward the altar, as if hearing a call only it could perceive. It stepped away from them, moving smoothly now, confidently. The doors reappeared. Light flooded in. Mariki dragged Peter toward the exit. Their bodies light, unreal, as if gravity had loosened its hold. They spilled out onto the cold stones of Kaiserskrækt, gasping, weeping. Behind them, the church stood still. Lifeless. For now. At dawn, passersby noticed something new. The building seemed larger than it had the day before, as if it were still growing. And inside, something practiced breathing slow. Patient, eternal waiting for night to fall again. It was a night without wind, without cloud, without the slightest stir along the misted canals of Amsterdam. The air was unnaturally still, heavy as if anticipating something. Locals had begun speaking quietly about the church, about the whispers. The moving crucifix, the dreams but few dared approach it. Those who had returned pale, mute, their hands trembling as if they still carried the touch of stone fingers against their own flesh. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the city trembled. It began with the bells, not a single bell, but all of them, ringing together in perfect, discordant unison. The sound rose from the bell tower and split across the canals, rolling through narrow streets and echoing against brick facades. It was too sharp, too precise to be the work of wind. No ropes had been pulled. No human hand had touched them. The clamor was alive, demanding, each strike punctuated with a weight that pressed against the ribs of anyone who listened too closely. Mariki and Peter had been pacing the nave, trying to ignore the sense of iron and burnt incense that had returned overnight. The subtle pulse of the church beneath their feet quickened, keeping time with the ringing. Peter clutched a crucifix, shaking, whispering prayers into the air that tasted of copper. "They're ringing themselves," he said. His voice sounded wrong to him, hollow, like it came from a distant echo. Mariki didn't answer. She had already pressed herself against the far wall, eyes wide, waiting for what would appear. And then she saw it. The statue. Not in the nave. Not in the altar. It stood atop the bell tower, arms outstretched, wide and commanding. The night sky framed it, but the light did not touch it. A shadow radiated from the figure, blackening the canal below like spilled ink, spreading with the tide and curling along the edges of the buildings. The reflection in the water was wrong, distorted, as if the statue's image existed independently from the stone itself. No one had placed it there. No ladder. No crane. Nothing. Yet it balanced perfectly, defying height, wind, and gravity. Its feet were clean, almost impossibly so, but the dark stain of shadow stretched downward as though it were dripping life into the canal. Peter fell to his knees, staring upward. It watches everything. The bells continued to toll. Each strike seemed to slice the air, vibrating bones, rattling teeth, vibrating the very pulse of the city. Windows rattled. Cats screamed. Dogs howled. The air smelled faintly of iron, of burned incense, and of something older, darker, that neither of them could name. Marique's mind raced. The church had always moved, but this spectacle of height and sound was new. It was deliberate. It was communication, a warning, a claim. And then the shadows shifted. They moved along the canal, crawling toward the houses that dared to peer out. A few neighbors had ventured onto the street despite the hour. They froze in terror, staring upward at the silhouette of Christ on the bell tower. Some tried to run, but the shadows seemed to hold them in place, clinging to their skin, trailing along the cobblestones. The statue's eyes glimmered faintly in the darkness, catching the moonlight, though it was impossible to tell how. It seemed to know every secret, every fear. Peter grabbed Marique's arm. "We have to leave." "No." She nodded mutely, unable to take her eyes off the towering figure. The bells rang again, louder, each strike accompanied by a low, inhuman groan from within the stone. The city trembled, and for a moment it seemed as though the church itself had grown taller, its spire scraping the heavens. From below, the statue lowered its arms ever so slightly, and the shadow recoiled like a dark tide retreating. But the gesture felt more like a promise than relief, a silent declaration. It had shown its power. It had marked its territory. By the time Peter and Mariki reached the canal edge, the statue had disappeared. The bells fell silent, leaving only the pulse of the church beneath the streets. Beneath the water, beneath the very stones of the city, neighbors emerged, whispers and murmurs filling the empty night. Windows had been shattered by sound. Dogs barked into the void. Some swore the shadow had lingered, smeared along the cobblestones, as if the night itself had been defiled. The city slept fitfully, unaware of what had moved above them. Only Peter and Mariki knew. Only they understood the certainty. The church was no longer bound to the ground. The statue had claimed more than the nave, more than the walls, more than their minds. At sunrise, the bell tower looked untouched. No sign of climbing, no footprints, no disturbance. The canal reflected only water in the pale winter sun, but Mariki knew. The shadow would return, and the bells would ring again. Father Anton Cruz had not believed in miracles for years. His faith was disciplined, meticulous, a matter of ritual and obedience rather than sudden inspiration. But the reports coming from the Kaisersgracht church had rattled even him. Letters, whispered rumors, a growing trail of madness and disappearance. The diocese had ordered discretion, then silence. Anton's curiosity was stronger than obedience. He began in the archives. The Vatican's records were strict, orderly, and heavily guarded. Forbidden texts marked secretum, lined shelves like grave markers, with permission granted in secrecy. Anton examined the documents related to the church on Kaisersgracht, tracing correspondence between cardinals, nuncios, and bishops dating back centuries. The first note chilled him. It was brief. Do not allow this statue to be blessed. Seal it. No priest may pray over it. No mass may be performed at its altar. The object is not holy. It seems hungry. Further entries explained what had been feared for generations. The statue had been created in the 17th century by an obsessive sculptor whose faith had been unstable, who had tried to encapsulate divinity in wood and paint. But something else had lodged itself inside the figure during its creation. The entity feeds on guilt. One line read, "Faith strengthens it. Only disbelief or total submission can pacify it. Those who oppose it are broken. Those who ignore it are consumed." Anton read on notes written in trembling script. Priests driven mad by confessions. Children taken by the sound of the church breathing. Nuns found with their hands bent back, and parishioners clawing at the walls, scratching verses into stone, rewriting God's words into threats. The entity inside the statue was not Christ, not even a shadow of sanctity. It was a parasite, a dark intelligence, bound to the form of the crucified figure, learning, adapting, consuming. Anton understood immediately the scale of what he faced. This was no ordinary exorcism, no ritual of candles and prayer. To destroy it, or even to contain it, would require a radical rethinking of faith itself. Absolute disbelief could weaken it, rendering it impotent. But total submission, surrendering one's mind and guilt entirely, could also pacify it, feeding it temporarily without allowing it to move further. He thought of Mariki and Peter, of the boy Lucas, of Sister Helena, of all the victims. He shivered. Few had survived encounters with a statue. Even those who did were never the same. Anton began preparations carefully. He brought with him texts of theology, philosophy, and psychology. He studied guilt not as sin, but as an energy source. He catalogued every case of stigmata, dreams, hallucinations, the reports of movement and whispers. Every pattern pointed to one terrifying truth. The entity grew stronger, the more the church and its victims believed in its power. Faith was nourishment. He had one advantage. He was not a parishioner. not a caretaker, not someone who had grown up under the gaze of the eyes that never closed. He was an outsider, but faith was a difficult weapon to turn against itself. At 3:17 a.m., Anton entered the church. Candlelight barely penetrated the nave. The air was thick with the familiar coppery scent of iron and burned incense, and beneath the floor, the pulse of the building quickened. The statue stood perfectly still on its platform, arms outstretched, head tilted slightly, eyes fully open and unblinking. Anton spoke aloud, deliberately, his voice echoing against stone walls. "You are not God. You are nothing. You are wood, paint, and shadow. I do not believe." The air stilled, the walls shivered. The pulse beneath his feet faltered. A whisper slithered from the corners of the church, mimicking voices he had known, mocking him, tempting him with his own regrets. "You cannot deny me," it hissed, echoing in every tone Anton had ever feared or admired. "You belong. You are mine." Anton closed his eyes. He pressed every ounce of disbelief into himself. "You are nothing. Nothing. Nothing." The words formed a mantra, a shield against centuries of carved deception. The eyes of the statue seemed to falter, the wet shimmer on its face dimming slightly. But the entity was cunning. It did not attack outright. Instead, it whispered, softly now, questions of morality, guilt, failure, weakness. It tested him, probing, offering visions of everyone he had failed. Each one tugged at the edges of his resolve. He stumbled, almost giving in, almost believing. The pulse of the church grew erratic, faster, vibrating through his chest, through his bones. The walls seemed to breathe against him, pushing, pulling, flexing, alive. Anton steadied himself. "I do not serve you. I do not fear you. You have no claim over faith or sin." The eyes of the statue narrowed. The shadows beneath it writhed like ink. A low groan erupted, a sound like cracking wood and tearing flesh. The crucifix shivered, and the faintest shift occurred. The statue's feet scraped against the floor, just enough to leave a trace of dark moisture. And then silence. For a heartbeat, Anton could breathe. He understood the precarious truth. Destroying it completely might be impossible, but weakening it, resisting the fear and guilt it thrived upon, this was the first step. The church would wait. It always waited, but Anton now held the knowledge to meet it, armed not with devotion, but with disbelief. And somewhere above the nave, in the stillness of the sleeping city, the statue's eyes gleamed. Not triumphant, not angry. Calculating. Hungry. Yes, but wary. The false messiah had learned that resistance was possible, but it had also learned patience. And patience, centuries long, was its greatest weapon. They chose fire because it was simple, because it was final. Because every story ever told about evil ended with flame and ash and the promise that nothing, not stone, not wood, not belief could survive being reduced to smoke. Peter clung to that idea as if it were a prayer. Mariki did not argue. Father Anton did not bless the attempt. "There will be consequences," he said quietly. Not judgment. Reaction. They waited until night. Of course they did. At 3:17 a.m. the church was awake, breathing slow and deep, walls slick with damp warmth. The statue stood before the altar, not yet moving, not yet pretending. Its eyes were open. They always were. They brought gasoline in jerrycans, stolen from a construction site. Rags. Machas. Their hands shook as they worked, sloshing fuel across the stone floor, over the base of the statue, soaking the hem of its carved robe. The smell of iron thickened, as if the church recognized intent. "You are not Christ," Peter said hoarsely. "You are nothing." The statue did not answer. Mariki struck the match. The flame flared small and fragile in the vastness of the nave. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the fire caught. It climbed too fast, licking up the statue's legs, blooming across its torso. The wood beneath the paint blackened and split. Heat rushed outward, pressing against their faces. And then it screamed. not aloud. There was no sound in the air. No vibration. No echo. The scream unfolded inside their minds, instantaneous and total, drowning thought itself. It was layered, thousands of voices overlapping, crying out in agony and accusation and desperate certainty. Peter dropped to his knees, clutching his skull, convinced it would split open. "You burn yourselves," the voice said. "You always do." The fire did not spread. It clung to the statue, writhing unnaturally, refusing to leap to the pews or altar. Smoke did not rise. Instead, the flames folded inward, swallowed by the screaming presence at their center. Visions exploded behind their eyes. Amsterdam drowned. Canals overflowed not with water, but with bodies, bloated and pale, faces frozen in expressions of prayer and terror. Bridges sagged under their weight. Bells rang from beneath the surface, muffled and endless. Churches stood open, doors yawning wide. Inside them, statues crawled, not walking, dragging themselves across floors, stone fingers digging into tile, leaving trails of blood and dust. Crucifixes peeled themselves from walls. Madonnas turned their heads. Saints stepped down from alcoves, eyes shining with borrowed hunger. Everywhere, eyes, watching, judging, learning. Mariki screamed as she saw herself among them kneeling, hands bent backward, mouth open in silent confession. Pieter saw Lucas still drawing crosses, surrounded by 1,000 moving ones. Father Anton saw Rome swallowed whole, the Vatican collapsing inward as statues rang its bells. The voice returned. "Closer now. You taught me this," it said. "You built me with guilt and named me holy. You fed me with belief and called it salvation." The flames guttered. The statue stepped forward. Not free. Not unbound, but advancing nonetheless. Fire crawling across its body without consuming it. The wood beneath glowed, split, revealed something darker inside veins of shadow, pulsing like living tissue. The church convulsed. Walls buckled. Stone screamed. The pulse beneath the floor surged, wildly, erratic, desperate. Time fractured against seconds, stretching into eternities as the statue loomed, its burning face inches from theirs. "Faith breaks," it whispered, "and I am born from the fracture." Father Anton crawled forward, blood running from his nose, forcing his eyes open through the visions. "You are not God," he gasped. "You are the wound left when faith rots." For the first time, the scream faltered slightly. The fire flared bright white hot, now driven, not by belief, but by rage. The statue recoiled, one step back, then another. Cracks spread across its surface, glowing from within like dying stars. The visions collapsed. The fire yet. The statue fell. It did not shatter. It lay smoking, fractured, its eyes dim for the first time since anyone could remember. The church exhaled one long, exhausted breath and went still. Dawn found them alive. The statue was gone. In its place lay ash, splintered wood, and something blackened and unidentifiable embedded deep in the stone floor, still faintly warm. Amsterdam woke to a quiet city. No bells, no whispers. But faith, once broken, does not mend cleanly. And somewhere beneath the canals, beneath the churches, beneath the memories of those who survived, something waited, changed, diminished, but not destroyed. Because fire can burn belief, but guilt smolders forever. Dawn came gently, as if unwilling to disturb what remained. Sunlight slipped across Kaiserskrakte in thin gold ribbons, touching brick, water, and stone with careful restraint. The church stood exactly as it always had, no smoke, no scorch marks, no sign of violence. Its bell tower was silent. Its doors were closed. To an unknowing eye, it was merely old again. Authorities arrived before noon. They walked the nave with measured steps, notebooks in hand, faces composed into practiced neutrality. They smelled nothing unusual. The air was cool, faintly dusty, touched only by the residue of old incense, long settled into the stone. They photographed the altar. They examined the confession booths. They tapped walls and noted moisture, consistent with age and poor insulation. "There is no statue," one of them said, puzzled. "Are you certain it was here?" Peter did not answer. Mariki stood near the altar, unmoving, her gaze fixed on the floor, where the statue had fallen, where fire and screaming and belief itself had torn open the church. There was something new. Carved directly into the stone floor was a crucifix. Not placed, not assembled. Carved. The lines were deep and impossibly clean, as if the stone itself had yielded willingly. Christ's body was etched in stark detail ribs. Pronounced, head bowed, eyes half open, no wood, no nails. Just stone. Cold. Permanent. One of the officials knelt, running his fingers along the grooves. "Strange," he murmured. "This carving looks recent." "How recent?" Mariki asked quietly. The man hesitated. "Hours, at most. They sealed the church by evening. Officially, there was nothing to investigate. No missing statue. No signs of arson. No bodies. No witnesses reliable enough to contradict the evidence of empty space and solid stone." Peter and Mariki were advised to rest. Father Anton was asked politely, firmly, to return to Rome. Before he left, he stood once more at the church doors, staring inward. The nave felt hollow now, not dead, vacant. "It's not gone," he said softly. "It's dispersed." Mariki nodded. She already knew. That night, she dreamed nothing at all. No eyes, no whispers, no guilt pressed into shape. It was the first dreamless sleep she had known in months. Across the city, in the Jordan district, a small chapel prepared for reopening. It had been closed for years, neglected but intact, its stones scrubbed clean by well-meaning volunteers. A delivery arrived just before dusk in unmarked crate. No paperwork attached. The driver could not remember who had signed for it. Inside was a statue. Life-sized, Christ on the cross. The caretaker frowned. He did not remember ordering it. Still, it was beautiful, in a severe, unsettling way. The craftsmanship was exquisite. The eyes were half open. "Must be a donation," he muttered. They mounted it carefully against the wall behind the altar. It fit perfectly, as though measured in advance. When they stepped back, something about the room felt attenti. Porque attenti. By morning, the caretaker noticed the floor beneath the crucifix. The dust was disturbed. Bare footprints marked the stone. Damp. Fresh. They stood directly beneath the cross and did not lead away. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the church breathed in. Somewhere beneath Amsterdam, guilt shifted its weight, and Christ patient, silent, and learning opened his eyes.